Hear now a reading from the Gospel according to Luke. When some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, Jesus said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." They asked him, "Teacher, when will this be? And what will be the sign that is about to take place?" And he said, "Beware that you are not led astray. For many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and the time is near. Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first. But the end will not follow immediately." Then he said, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and plagues, and there will be dreadful portents and great signs from heaven. But before all this occurs, they will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify. So make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance, for I will give you words and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, by relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance you will gain your souls." May God add a blessing to this reading. Since we're pivoting to online for a few weeks this week, I pivoted on a sermon as well. And while we could talk about our hatred of the word pivot at this point in time, we're not going to. Today we're asking the question, what's the plural of apocalypse? Because we are in the midst of a great upheaval. I'm willing to bet that none of us is having fun in the great scheme of things. We're starting with the question, what's the plural of apocalypse? Because an apocalypse is not the end of the world. I'm guessing few of you have never heard that before because we live in a world that is convinced there is something that will end all things. So first, I'm going to tell you, I think it's important to think of apocalypses, not an apocalypse. By all accounts I can find, apocalypses is the appropriate plural of apocalypse. So let's think and talk about apocalypses. If you're over the age of 80, you've lived through about 70 predicted dates for the apocalypse, not to be confused with an apocalypse. At least 70 different times somebody said the world would end. Some of the apocalypse predictions, of course, are more notable than others. Jehovah's Witnesses believed the return of Jesus was imminent around 1914, and they kept that up through the 30s and 40s. Dorothy Martin was a woman in Chicago who believed the world would end on December 21st, 1954, by a great flood. The message came from aliens on a planet called Clarion, and she founded a group called the Seekers, believing they would be rescued before the flood that would destroy the earth. When it didn't happen, it was because the Seekers' light had been bright enough to transform the world, at least enough to hold off its destruction. February 4th, 1962, marked the dawning of the Age of Aquarius. And it was met with prayer vigils spawned by famous psychics that were sure this was bringing about the end of things. Jim Jones, famous for being a preacher at the People's Temple, said it was July 15th, 1967, when everything would end in a nuclear war. Charles Manson was certain it was coming in a 1969 race war Pat Robertson has been talking about the end of the world since at least 1982, but he comes up with a new reason every few years. You might remember Harold Camping from a few years ago, who started later than Robertson in 1994, but he's also spent a lot of time saying that the world is going to end. And most of us remember the chaos of 1999 and Y2K, when we didn't know what would happen at the millennium. Pick one for the end of the world. It's not just thanks to media that predictions of an apocalypse have ramped up mightily in the last 150 years. Christians began talking about it seriously, or at least with a solid eye to the millennium. The year 2000 freaked Christians out, much as the year 1000 had freaked out people before them. Millennia, it seems, always must bring something. So around 1850, Christians, and let's be clear, we mean almost all U.S. frontier Christians, started codifying various views of what would happen at the millennium, all of which focused on the return of Christ. This particular version of millennialism took on a life of its own, including creation of ideas such as the rapture, a time when all of the faithful would be taken to heaven. If you're starting to think about Kirk Cameron and the Left Behind series, you're definitely thinking in the right vein. But regardless of your religious background, you've inherited a Christian landscape that has these ideas floating around, especially when it comes to pop culture Christianity. It's also the reason the hair on your arms might stand up if you think about the book of Revelation, because those Christians who were coming up with all these versions of millennialism were primarily relying on reading that book. So there are three main versions of that view. One is premillennialism. Jesus returns to earth before a literal 1,000-year reign of peace. There's a tribulation before that time, a time when the world becomes particularly corrupt and no longer able to be saved. There's a version within that itself called dispensational premillennialism. Jesus will come, take the church, then the time of tribulation starts, then the church gets to reign with Jesus for the 1,000 years of peace after the tribulation. Then another version is called postmillennialism. Jesus returns after 1,000 years of peace. Essentially a golden age of Christianity. It's a time when Christian ethics prosper. With that view, it becomes especially important to spread Christianity everywhere and convert everyone, because after that happens, Jesus comes back. And then there's amillennialism, which rejects a literal 1,000-year period of time, but is awaiting a second coming. These are the views that create concern about last battles and a final thing, whatever that is. We also do pretty well to toss all these views out the door. We live in a world that is occasionally volatile, and so if we start talking about not an apocalypse or the apocalypse, but instead apocalypses, we find many of them. The truth is, things have happened numerous times throughout history and even in our lives that create a clear before and after. What used to be isn't anymore and will never be that way again. In the year 79, Mount Vesuvius erupted, covering most of the city of Pompeii in ashes. 11,000 people were gone in nearly an instant. There were only a few survivors left who had nothing of their lives before. Right now, we're hearing more and more about the Black Death. It hit about 1350 and swept through much of Europe. It killed between 75 and 200 million people, 30 to 60% of Europe's population. It was the result of trade and introducing rodents with fleas. We now think rather than rats, those fleas came with gerbils. The world was ending, had ended every day. Who knew what would come next? Europeans settling in North America was an apocalypse for those already living here. Most recent estimates place populations at more than 10 million people when Europeans first landed. That population fell to about 300,000 within 400 years. Smallpox was the primary cause of death, sometimes wiping out entire tribes. Domesticated animals introduced even more diseases, sometimes wiping out populations long after the European conquerors had gone. Apocalypses happen. During the last few years, it has become evident we are living through an apocalypse. The world is not the same as it was. Our political environment is increasingly divided. It's increasingly volatile. We wonder what's coming next. The COVID-19 pandemic messes with everything, including church. So if things feel uncertain and unsteady, it's because they are. We are living in the uncertain time of something ending and another beginning. Unfortunately, both the ending and the beginning are ambiguous. We are in our own apocalypse. We read a Bible, though, that has chunks of apocalyptic literature, each one rooted in an apocalypse of their own. In other words, every piece of apocalyptic literature was written to people whose world had ended or was ending, and they weren't sure what was coming yet. The book of Daniel was written as the people's land was invaded, the altar in the temple destroyed, and the temple itself is lost for a while. Revelation is written to Christians who are being killed for their illegal faith. And the gospel text we read today was part of that. The story of the collapse of the temple is written to people wondering if Jesus is coming back in the wake of the destruction of the temple. It was written when the city was sieged, plundered, and destroyed. The gospel reading is the story of an apocalypse, wondering what it was before and what will be after that second temple. Part of the hope is that there will be the kingdom of heaven, whatever comes in the apocalypse. And most important of all, an apocalypse is an opportunity for the reign of God to break in more fully. You see, biblical apocalyptic literature is always meant to give hope. If it doesn't, reread it, read it better, read it differently, read it with other people. Because presumably, an apocalypse is an occasion for hope. It's not our undoing as people of faith. It becomes a time we believe that God has not abandoned us. And even more importantly, God is not done. God will still do more. So even as things end, there is this deep, abiding hope that an end is not the end. God is always breaking in, doing something new. God is waiting for the chance to recreate what comes after. God is waiting for the chance to redeem all the terrible, difficult things. The present is still hard. But one of the most helpful things we can do might be to recognize it is an apocalypse. The great upheaval is not around us, that is around us is not imagined. It is just as hard as it feels. But we trust that God can still redeem this apocalypse too. and God can call a new creation out of it. Amen.